Kia ora koutou, no mai haere mai, Kolisa Marriott, toko ingoa. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming along to listen to Max and my talk today on political donations, conflicts of interest and options for change. Max and I are going to do a bit of a tag team today. So in fact, Max is going to start, so I'm going to hand over to him now, and then we will jump in and out over the next half hour or so and aim to finish within maybe about 30 minutes, so we have lots of time to have a good korero at the end. Kia ora, Max.
Cool. Kia ora koutou, and hello to everyone who's following this over Zoom as well as in the room itself. And what Lisa and I are going to be talking about is based on research that we did last year, research funded through the Gamma Endowment Fund into political party funding in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which we both did through our sort of respective roles in the School of Government. And so that work that we did last year produced a report called Money for Something, Political Party Funding in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And it involved us looking at political donations through a couple of means. One was that we went out and interviewed quite a few players within the system in order to understand how the system of funding political parties works in New Zealand and what concerns people within that system have about it. So we interviewed some major donors to political parties, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. We interviewed past and present party presidents and general secretaries, MPs, one former prime minister, several fundraisers and political party leaders as well. And then on top of that, we ran a survey to get a sense of what the wider New Zealand public thinks about the issue, and a couple of focus groups. And our interest in all of this stems from some concerns that I imagine will be pretty familiar to people in the room. Largely, this is all part of the things I guess you might call trading and influence, the various mechanisms like political party donations, but also lobbying and political appointments that people use to further their own interests, potentially at the expense of the public good, however that's defined. So people using these mechanisms to potentially purchase access and influence that isn't available to the rest of us. And within that, there's a couple of specific concerns. One can be the individual access and influence that people can gain that may come at the expense of others. But political donations also raise pretty well-worn concerns about fundraising imbalances. So if one political party or one side of politics can raise vastly more funds than others, then the political competition may not be held on a level playing field. One side may have much better chance of getting its message out and winning votes than the other. But that, of course, depends a bit on sort of the sums of money involved, on which point I'll hand over to Lisa.
Thank you, Max. So, of course, we do want our political parties to be well funded. We want them to be able to develop good policy and then communicate that policy, to anybody who is interested. And that is why, in particular, we're really interested in these imbalances. So the next couple of slides I'm going to show you are showing you where the large donations have gone over the past 2 or 3 years. Before I show you the first graph, I just want to clarify that the rules did change around disclosure of large donations towards the end of last year. So up until the end of last year, donations over 30,000 had to be disclosed within 10 days of them being provided. That reduced to 20,000 at the start of this year. So there is a slight difference with the rules around what is disclosed. The figure that I'm about to show you, and I will show you now, just has the large donations. So these are the ones that are over 20,000 for this year, over 30,000 for last year. And The idea here is that the numbers are specifically just for what you will see for 2023. Now, it is an election year. That will not have escaped anybody in this room. So you do see more money going into political parties in election year. However, of course, there was a very well publicised fundraising campaign last year for the National Party that was very visible. And you can see that in the figures that are here. So 2022, which is the grey coloured column there. National did very well last year with their fundraising as well, with that deliberate and visible attempt that they had there. But the pattern that you see across the other parties tends to be a wee bit more traditional. So lower amounts in non-election years, and then the larger amounts coming in election years. So just also to clarify, the reason why we've only got the 5 main parties here, not 5 main parties, but 5 parties, is because these are the ones that tend to usually get the most amount of funding. So of course there are smaller amounts going to the other parties, but this is where the larger sums are going. The next figure that I'm going to show you is just to show you the imbalance that Max referred to. So a little bit of color coding on this pie graph. So looking at those numbers for 2022 and 2023, and again, this is just the large donations. We've focused in on the large donations because those are the ones that are likely to perhaps get people the access that we heard about when we were doing our interviews and so on. So you can see here over last year and this year, up until Wednesday last week is when this count stops, National have got 47%, so nearly half of those large donations, and ACT have got 29%. So with those 2 parties on the right, over 3/4 of the large donations are going there. And then with the Labour, Greens, New Zealand First, they're getting 8% each. So we do have quite an imbalance with where that money is going. Now I'm going to hand you back to Max now, who's going to talk to you about some of the key themes that came out, particularly from the interviews that we did. So Max.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And it's also just briefly on sort of the donations amount. I mean, even if you sort of zoom out, it's probably worth saying beyond just those very large donations and you look at sort of the totals of all the donations that are reported, you still see a very large fundraising imbalance. Since the 2020 election, National and ACT have raised something in the order of $13 million across all the donations that we currently know about, and Labour and the Greens probably in the order of something more like $2 million. That doesn't include donations of under $1,500, which don't have to be disclosed except for the anonymous ones. And it's possible that Labour and Greens fundraising of those smaller amounts restores the balance to some extent, but no one we spoke to in our research thought it made a huge difference in the greater scheme of things. So various kinds of imbalances there. So one of the big parts of this research is that we went and interviewed a number of people in the system, as I said at the outset, and that was motivated partly by, of course, a long history of scandals and concerning incidents surrounding political donations in New Zealand, which includes donors to both major political parties having citizenship approved against the advice of officials, in one instance a minister interfering in a police investigation into a donor, multiple instances of donations being concealed or not properly disclosed, and a couple of really big high-profile court cases recently involving New Zealand First, National and Labour, all of which revealed either basically in my view clear instances of the rules being broken by what were in effect donations being hidden from the public through various mechanisms. So we went and we spoke to people in the system about what they thought about how the system for funding political parties works. And they were unsurprisingly of the view that political parties do need to be adequately funded. They're an important part of the political system. They have to be able to go out there, engage in the contest of ideas, at least in theory, get their message out to voters and all the rest of it. but everyone we spoke to was agreed that transparency of funding, at least, was essential. However, we also heard a lot of concern from people within the system that there were too many opportunities to circumvent the existing rules. One former political party fundraiser called it an accident waiting to happen. There was a very strong sense that with the rules being relatively complex and there being opportunities to hide donations, for instance, by splitting them into smaller amounts so that they're below the threshold where the donor's identity has to be disclosed, and with the Electoral Commission having relatively weak powers to look into any of this, to the extent that the system did function well, what we were told was that very much relied on sort of the personal integrity of people in the system. And if there were people operating in it who didn't have particularly high levels of integrity, then there were far too many opportunities for wrongdoing to occur. We were also told that there was probably not a lot of large-scale corruption, although, of course, whether people would have told us had there been any is an open question. But certainly people acknowledged the perception that there was. And even then, we certainly got told about some pretty concerning incidents. We heard more than one account of political party leaders being at public events and people coming up to them literally with envelopes stuffed with cash, the sort of thing that you think only happens in other countries. Now, in both those instances, the people telling us that anecdote insisted that, of course, they had dealt with this in a very upfront and correct manner in which they had sort of, rejected the attempt to hand that envelope directly to the leader of that party, and it had been channeled through the correct channels and all that sort of thing. But, of course, that is the account that people are going to give you when you're talking to them. And then lastly, particularly the donors that we spoke to, the 8 major donors, who are donors to all, across multiple of major political parties, they all insisted that they didn't buy any influence as a result of their donations. But when we sort of pushed back on that a bit, it became clear that they were certainly deriving some pretty strong advantages. They were all very clear to begin with that they donated to a political party because they supported its goals and they wanted to see its policies advanced, not just because they believed, they supported democracy, quote unquote, which is often the public description of why donors give. It's the description that Paula Bennett always gives about National Party fundraising, for instance. So the donors were very clear that that wasn't the case. They weren't supporting democracy, quote unquote. They were seeking to, advance an ideological view that they agreed with. One of them said to us, I'm slightly far right as a business owner, so if a party doesn't, support business, I'm not going to donate to it. One donor also sort of openly said to us, well, look, a donation makes it easier to get a meeting with a minister. So very clearly saying that they were buying access. Now, access is not the same as influence, but it's obviously a precondition. Very hard to influence people you can't get access to. So there was that. And there was also very, very cozy relationships that were revealed in these interviews. So, for instance, one donor said to us, oh, well, of course, I don't get any influence from my donations. And we said, well, you must sort of come into contact a lot with politicians. And they said, oh, yes, well, quite apart from the fact that I live on the same street as John Key. When I was a Labour donor, Helen Clark came around for dinner a couple of times. And now that I'm an ACT donor, David Seymour pops around, quote, for a chat about life, unquote. And this was all said as if this were all totally normal and natural, as if it happened to all of us, as if I'm sort of constantly, having Chris Hipkins asked to come around to my house for dinner and just sort of fending politicians off with a stick. And so the impression we got very strongly was of a not particularly transparent world where fundraisers and donors and party leaders were coming into constant contact with each other, dinners at donors' houses, fundraising events, auctions, sitting together for long periods at tables, just this very strong process of socialization and connection. And frankly, if that didn't lead to some kind of influence, then most of our intuitions about the world would be incorrect, I think. And on that happy note, I'll hand over to Lisa to talk about the public survey.
Right. So moving from talking about those on the inside to looking at the views of those somewhat more on the outside. So what we did was around about this time last year, we did a survey of around about 1,000 people, just over actually, nationally representative sample. I will just caveat what I'm about to show you when I say nationally representative sample is, of course, a lot of the population are not very politically involved, and you can actually see that coming through in some of the data that I'm about to share with you. But we had two main parts to this survey. So there was some requests for general views on donations and political parties and so on. And then what we did, because we were interested in state funding and what people would think of state funding, we put forward 3 options of different state funding to see what people thought about those. So we're not going to show you all the data, just a very, very small snapshot of particularly of the part 1 data. So this is just to give you an idea of some of the questions that we asked. So first one, and links quite nicely to what Max was just talking about with transparency. We asked how important were each of these things to our respondents. And the first one is that parties provide information on where their money is coming from. So transparency. So on your left, the red on your left, in case you can't see the little writing at the bottom, the darker red is when our survey respondents said it was very important, and the brighter red is where it was somewhat important. The blue is where it's not really important at all, or just only really not a small level of importance. Now, I said to you about the political engagement. You'll see there are a couple of grey boxes in the middle. So the lighter grey is where people are neutral, and then the darker grey is where people are unsure. And I'll talk you through this as we go through these questions, but actually some of the people in the middle there, either undecided or neutral or unsure, some of these numbers are actually quite big. So let's start with transparency. Over 3/4 of our respondents felt that it was important that parties should provide some transparency on where their money's coming from. And only 7% felt this was unimportant. And that very much ties in with everything that we heard from our other data source collection, so particularly the focus groups and the interviews. We then asked another couple of questions about who should be able to donate. So we asked a question about whether people living outside New Zealand should be able to donate. And as you can see there, less than half said that that was important. Another one that we asked was whether only enrolled voters, so in other words, natural persons, should be able to donate. So specifically ruling out companies, trade unions, that type of thing. And again, you're starting to see relatively small amounts of people thinking this, or smaller amounts of people thinking this was important. So just over 40% said that was important, but also note in the middle there, you've got a large group of people, another 40%, who are essentially undecided on that one. But interestingly enough, the amounts of people who are saying these things are not important are still actually relatively small. And then the last one we're going to share with you of this type of question is whether people thought it was important that political parties essentially should expand their base of donors, so should raise most of their money from smaller donors rather than larger donors. Again, around about 1/3 of people said that that was important, but again, about half of them at this point in the middle there without a strong view on that one. And again, as I said earlier, I think this just reflects the sort of lack of political engagement with it, a reasonable subsection of the population. So then what we wanted to do is we wanted to get into the idea a little bit more of state funding. So we asked a question about what's the right balance for where political parties should get their money. And the first one there is basically the row at the top is only private donations. So 28% of people said, yep, should only be from donations from supporters. And the other 4 in red essentially allow for some component of state funding, just different degrees of state funding. So the 3% at the bottom is only state funding, and then the other 3 in the middle are, you know, some balance between private funding and state funding. So if we look at the proportion of people who were happy to have at least some degree of state funding, that comes to about 58% of our respondents in this survey, and a relatively small amount of people who were unsure with this one. So then what we did is we gave our respondents 3 policy ideas to think about, and we asked for each of these ideas what people thought of them and whether they would support them. So here are the 3 options, and you know, some are more or less radical than others. So the first one, the per vote funding, this is used a lot overseas to fund political parties. So pretty straightforward by way of idea. It's after an election, parties get funded based on the amount of votes that they get. So the proposal that we put forward was $2 for each vote up to roughly 10%.
Your lapel.
I haven't got my microphone on, so I don't think any of our settings have changed. There we go, seems to have sorted itself out. $2 for each vote up to a relatively lowish sort of threshold, and then $1 for any subsequent votes beyond that. And the idea of having it tiered is that it doesn't overly advantage the larger or the incumbent parties. With that per vote funding, usually what you see in practice is a lump sum, some sort of lump sum provision alongside that. We didn't put that into our proposal here because it was just, we felt it would have been just sort of overwhelming people with information. So that was option 1, as I say, really common, relatively common globally. The second one is tax credits. So you're probably familiar with the system that we have at the moment for tax credits for charitable donations. So you make a donation to charity and you get 33% of it back. Our policy settings that we gave our respondents were based on the system in Canada, which works really well for them. And it's quite generous the way they have their tax credit amount set up. So we pretty much copied their policy settings for our proposal here. And the idea was that we, for a donation of $400 to a political party, the political party would get the $400, the donor would get $300 back. So it's a 75% tax credit. And that's exactly what they do in Canada. In Canada, it is tiered as well. So it's not an unlimited amount of money that you can donate and get 3/4 of it back. It's actually only up to 400 Canadian dollars, and then it abates based on higher levels of donation. So for each of these options, we did provide a little bit more detail, but not overly much. We didn't want to overwhelm people. And then the third option here is democracy vouchers. And this was one that Max came up with, but when I say came up with, he didn't invent. They do this in Seattle, in Washington. It's Washington State in the US. And the idea is that your enrolled voters literally get given a voucher that they can then pass on to their political party of their choosing. So we set this at a relatively low amount when we were putting this to our respondents. We said $20 because we wanted to keep it within a sort of a costing threshold that we were working with. But in the US, in Seattle, they send to their enrolled voters 4 vouchers of $25 each, so $100 US. So it is actually quite generous. And that way the people can split it, they can send it to different parties if they want. So here is what our respondents said in relation to each of these. So again, pretty big numbers of people undecided, but more people supporting these options than not supporting them in any case, in all the cases. Tax credits surprisingly were, I thought it was surprising, were the ones that got the most support. Per vote funding was the one that received the least, which again, I thought was sort of interesting. I thought the per vote funding would have been the one that attracted the most interest. And democracy vouchers, again, given that this would be reasonably radical policy, also received a reasonable degree of support. So that was just some of the findings. Obviously, if you do want to read more about that, it is all in the report. I'm going to hand back to Max now. Max is going to talk you through some of the findings that we did, because we did a really comprehensive analysis of what is done internationally. And he is also just, which I think is quite topical given that costings of policy is all we seem to be talking about at the moment. We are just going to show you how we costed out that proposal for tax credits, just so that it you can essentially see how little it would actually cost to put into practice. So thank you, Max.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lisa. I mean, it's interesting on that per vote funding being relatively less popular than you might have thought. I think that might be because we also did some focus groups, which we're not presenting the results of here. And what came through in that was a real concern, I think, that smaller parties be well funded, and that systems not overly favour incumbents. And I suspect that even with sort of per vote funding being structured to try to push back against incumbency, that's still what people heard, that it would reinforce incumbency. So that might be what's going on there. Yeah, okay, so a little bit about international approaches to regulating political party finance, which, as Lisa said, we did quite a big survey of 32 countries in the OECD, for which we could find reasonably good data. And various findings sort of come out of that. Most OECD countries require publication of the donor's identity if they give over $5,000. At the time we were doing our research, that threshold in New Zealand was 15,000. So we were, reasonably out of step with the OECD, I would say. Some of the changes that Lisa referred to at the end of last year, that the current government brought in, has taken the threshold for disclosure down to $5,000 in New Zealand as well. So we're coming more into line with the OECD. But there are still a number of countries that require disclosure of the donor's identity at lower levels, over $1,500, say. So there's still certainly further we could go on that. We're one of only a third of countries in our OECD sample, so only 11, I think, that allow unlimited donations. You can give as much as you like to a political party, and someone has just given the National Party $500,000 in one go. In most countries, that would not be possible. They set limits. Those limits can be quite high. I mean, some countries, the limit is $100,000 a year. But in Canada, for instance, Lisa's already referred to Canada, the limit is in the ballpark of about $2,000 New Zealand a year. So you can have very stringent limits on these things, and some countries do, and they're obviously doing so to try to restrict the opportunities for purchasing access and influence. New Zealand is also a bit of an outlier, having no restrictions on what type of entities can donate. And again, Lisa sort of touched on this a bit earlier. There's no sort of systematic approach to this in the OECD, but most countries restrict donations from companies or trade unions or both, and we don't really do either of that. So I'd say that even with the changes that have occurred since we were doing this research, we're still at the weakly regulated end where it comes to donations. So in terms of what we ended up recommending in our report, Money for Something, we had 5 key recommendations. The first was that the threshold for disclosing donors' identity should be lowered to $1,500. Loosely on the basis that there's no evidence that donations below that amount purchase access or influence. And people do have some reasonable expectation of privacy when giving small amounts to the political party of their choice. If you had to disclose every donation to political parties, and you'd be effectively forcing people to publicly declare their political allegiances if they wanted to support that party financially. We recommend, and that's a recommendation that was essentially endorsed in the Independent Electoral Review Panel's interim report this year. We suggested capping the amount you can donate in any given year at $15,000 to each political party. And the Independent Electoral Panel this year recommended, well, effectively $10,000. So again, same sort of ballpark. We recommend that the Electoral Commission needs greater powers to investigate potential wrongdoing when it comes to political donations. We recommended that only eligible voters should be able to donate. And lastly, we made some recommendations for state funding. And just on that, briefly, I should say, I mean, this is a complex question because, you know, some people in the public would probably perceive that we don't have state funding of political parties, but in point of fact, we do in at least two forms. There's the broadcasting allowance every year, with political parties get between them several $1 million for their election advertising. There's also quite significant funding for parties to carry out their parliamentary duties, so quite large, in the tens of millions of dollars allocations in the budget for the leaders' offices of political parties to carry out research and communications and policy development and so on and so forth. So actually, we already have state funding of political parties in New Zealand. It's the question is how best to do it. And sort of the question we're focused in on here is, could we have a system whereby there is greater state funding for parties to carry out their political activities, so going out and campaigning and talking to voters and developing policies, that would compensate for limiting the amounts that they get in private donations, which is obviously what we've suggested. So this isn't, you know, sort of terra nullius stuff. This is just in addition to an existing system of state funding. And so we kind of looked at the Canadian system, which, just to recap, limits donations at $2,000 a year, but has very generous tax credit subsidizing smaller donations. And really the idea there, which I think is very sound, is you're trying to shift from a system whereby parties rely on, well, the whole system relies on large amounts from small numbers of people, towards a system that relies on small amounts from large numbers of people. So effectively, you want to design a system, I think, where parties are well resourced, but they get that resourcing by going out and engaging with the widest possible number of ordinary New Zealanders. And then, because you've got lots of people giving small amounts, it's much harder to exert influence for any given individual. And so the average donation in Canada is about, you know, equivalent to sort of $275 New Zealand, and the donations amounts are sort of $7 million or so in a given year, and it's the equivalent of having about 30,000 donors in New Zealand under this model. And so then when we sort of pretty roughly costed that, you know, we looked at that model of, you know, you get up to 75% of your donation back as a tax credit, and looking at, you know, what on average that would cost a given donor and what the party would receive, you know, using sort of various assumptions, that came out at a cost to the state of around $7 million, which is also about where our estimates of a sort of reasonable per vote funding system would come out, because we thought we'd test that as well. And the Independent Electoral Review, again, this year, they favoured per vote funding. And again, their costings came out very much in the same ballpark as ours. And so sort of the underlying point here is probably not put too much stress on the precision of the numbers, but is more that actually how small a sum it would take to get rid of big money donations in politics. Effectively, the pitch here is that for about $2 per person, per voter, we could have a system in which there are no donations, annual donations bigger than $15,000, and political parties are going out and getting their funding from, you know, a wide range of ordinary New Zealanders, or at least a subset of that population. So $2 per person to clean big money donations and the potential for access and influence that they bring right out of the system, which we thought was a pretty good deal. And just in closing, I know that Lisa and I finished up this work in November last year, but since then, we've only seen more issues around donations. Stuart Nash having to resign as a minister for having shared confidential cabinet information with people who happen to be his donors, and the National Party putting out press releases in favour of companies and claiming they didn't know. The people who put out the press release claiming they didn't know that the company that they were supporting in that press release had also effectively been quite a large donor to their party. So these issues remain live ones as we come into the general election next month. Thank you very much.